My name is Sloane, and I've been drinking the same chamomile tea for 11 years, ever since my mother told me it was a childish habit I'd eventually outgrow. I never did. The text came in at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the exact time, because I just poured a fresh cup and the steam was still rising when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I read it once, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to make sure I felt whatever I was supposed to feel before I decided not to feel it. Don't call or come over. We're done. And don't even think about the will, sweetie. That last word.
Sweetie.
She always used it like a blade wrapped in ribbon. I set my phone face down, picked up my mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea was still hot. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler clicked on and off in lazy, indifferent rhythm. I picked the phone back up and typed 2 words.
Got it.
Sent. Then I turned on the stove to make dinner because I was genuinely hungry and the world hadn't actually ended.
Not yet, anyway.
My mother and I had been doing this dance for 34 years, but this time felt different. Quieter. The way a room feels after something irreversible has already happened.
I ate dinner.
Grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, a glass of white wine I'd been saving for no particular occasion. I sat at my own table in my own apartment, and I did not cry. That surprised me a little. 6 months ago, a text like that would have sent me to the bathroom floor. But 6 months ago, I didn't know what I knew now. I found out in March, not from her, not from my brother Colt, but from a paralegal named Denise who had once worked for my father's estate attorney and felt guilty enough to call me from a personal cell phone on a Sunday morning. Denise told me the will had been rewritten.
Twice.
Both times after visits from Colt, who still lived 20 minutes from my mother and showed up every Sunday with flowers and an agenda. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call a lawyer. I just started paying attention. And the thing about finally paying attention is, you start seeing everything you were too trusting to notice before. Colt had always been the favorite in the way that never got spoken aloud. It lived in the silences, in who got called first with good news, in whose college tuition came without a single attached condition. I used to excuse it. Birth order. Personality. The fact that he was the son, and my mother came from a generation that treated that like it meant something. I built myself a whole architecture of reasons so I wouldn't have to feel the truth of it. The truth was simpler and uglier. She chose him, consistently, and I kept showing up anyway. After Denise's call, I started keeping records. Not obsessively, methodically. Every conversation I could remember. Dates, amounts, decisions. My father had left behind more than my mother ever acknowledged publicly. A lake house in Vermont.
2 investment accounts.
A storage unit outside of Raleigh nobody ever mentioned at the funeral. I found the storage unit through a document in my father's old email, an account I had the password to because he'd given it to me 3 weeks before he died, quietly, like he was handing me something he didn't have time to explain. Maybe he knew something I didn't. Maybe he'd been paying attention far longer than I had. The storage unit was climate-controlled, fluorescent lit, and smelled like cedar and old paper. I drove to Raleigh on a Wednesday, told no one, and stood inside it for a long time before I touched anything. My father had been a methodical man, quiet in the way that gets mistaken for passive. He kept files the way other people keep photographs, carefully, chronologically, like he understood that memory alone was never enough. There were 3 banker's boxes along the back wall. The first held tax documents going back 20 years. The second held correspondence, letters, printed emails, a few handwritten notes I recognized as my mother's. The third held something I wasn't prepared for, a separate will, drafted 8 months before my father died, notarized, witnessed, and never filed. In it, the lake house went to me. Both investment accounts split equally. There was a letter tucked inside the document, addressed in my father's handwriting. My name on the envelope, the ink slightly faded, the seal still intact. I sat down on the concrete floor and held it without opening it for a very long time. Outside, a truck backed up somewhere in the facility. The fluorescent light above me buzzed once, steadily, like a held breath. I finally opened it. My father's handwriting was small and even, the kind that never changed from line to line. He'd written 4 pages front and back, in blue ink, without a single cross-out. He knew. Not suspected, knew. He discovered 2 years before his death that my mother had been quietly redirecting joint assets into a separate account. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. He'd hired someone to document it, and the documentation was paper-clipped neatly to the back of the letter, like an appendix to a business report. He didn't confront her. He told me why in the 3rd paragraph. He was already sick by then, tired in a way that went deeper than treatment could reach, and he didn't want his last months to become a courtroom. He wanted to go quietly. But he didn't want me to go unprotected. I should have said this out loud while I had time. He wrote near the end. You were always the one who paid attention. I need you to keep doing that. I read the letter twice. Then I photographed every document in all 3 boxes, uploaded everything to an encrypted drive, and locked the unit behind me like nothing inside had just rearranged the entire architecture of my life. I drove home. My mother's text was still sitting unanswered on my phone.
Sweetie.
I called Denise the next morning. She picked up on the 2nd ring, like she'd been waiting. She had been waiting. She told me she'd left the estate attorney's firm 8 months ago, partly because of what she'd been asked to witness, partly because she hadn't been able to sleep properly since. She had copies of the revised wills, both versions, and she'd kept them in a folder she described as her insurance policy against her own conscience. We met at a coffee shop in Durham, a neutral city neither of us lived in. She was younger than I'd imagined, mid-30s, with tired eyes and a very steady voice. She slid a manila envelope across the table, without ceremony. Inside were the 2 revised wills, both dated after my father's death, both bearing my mother's signature, and both systematically reducing my inheritance in increments small enough to look like oversight rather than intention. Colt's name appeared in the margins of the second one, handwritten, next to a figure that made my coffee go cold. I didn't feel rage. That's what surprised me. I felt something more clarifying than rage, a clean, cold certainty that I had everything I needed and absolutely no reason to rush. I thanked Denise. I paid for both coffees. Then I called an estate litigation attorney whose number I'd already saved 3 weeks prior. The attorney's name was Patricia Voss. She had 22 years of estate litigation experience, a reputation for methodical precision, and an office that smelled like good coffee and old wood. She reviewed everything I brought in 45 minutes flat, without a single dramatic reaction, which told me she'd seen worse, and won anyway. She told me the unfiled will created a viable challenge. The documented asset redirection created a separate civil claim. Combined with Denise's testimony and the paper trail from my father's private documentation, she used the word substantial 3 times in one sentence, which I understood to mean we were not operating on hope. Patricia filed the initial paperwork on a Friday afternoon. By that same evening, my mother's attorney had been formally notified. I was home by 7, chamomile tea steeping, window open, the kind of early summer air that feels like the season is making a quiet promise. My phone sat on the counter, face up this time. At 11:43 p.m., it started. First a call from my mother, then Colt, then my mother again. Then 3 texts from a number I didn't recognize that I suspected was my Aunt Linda, who had always functioned as my mother's emotional subcontractor. I watched the screen light up, again and again, without touching it. The tea was perfect. I let them call until they stopped, which took until 2 a.m. In the morning, I made coffee instead of tea, a small, deliberate change, and sat by the window while the neighborhood came back to life around me. A dog walker. A woman in scrubs heading to her car. Ordinary Tuesday morning things, happening exactly as they always had, indifferent to the fact that my family had spent the night unraveling. Colt texted at 8 a.m. We need to talk. Mom is devastated. You're destroying this family over money. I read it once and set the phone down without responding because there was nothing to say to someone who'd mistaken my silence for weakness for 34 years and was only now discovering the difference. The legal process took 4 months. Patricia was precise and relentless in a way that never raises its voice. My mother settled rather than go to court, which told me everything about what she knew she'd done. The lake house in Vermont transferred to my name on a Thursday in October. I drove up that weekend alone, unlocked the front door, and stood on the porch overlooking the water while the trees burned amber and gold around me. My father had sat on this same porch. I understood now why he loved it. I made chamomile tea, took a slow sip, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely and entirely at peace.